we've been through a lot together, right? These are vicious, horrible people. I call it the enemy from within. It's the enemy from within. All the scum that we have to deal with that hate our country, that's a bigger enemy than China and Russia. The enemy from within is a very sick group of people, I can tell you, because I had to go through years of Russia, 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 and they knew it was fake. We have an enemy from within, which I think is much more dangerous than the outside enemy.
In the waning days of his presidential campaign, Donald Trump picked up the pace of that refrain. The enemy within, the enemy within. He used it over and over again to describe what he calls a long list of his own political enemies, people who he believes wronged him in some way, disagreed with him, investigated him or his campaign, especially those who sought to hold him to account and those who charged him with crimes. Democrats, government officials, Republicans, judges, news organizations, jurors, all of whom he said, we showed you some of it, were, quote, more dangerous than any of America's foreign adversaries. And now in his selection of Kash Patel to lead the FBI, he has found someone who publicly seems to share in the belief that there are dangerous people inside our country, in government service, in the media, and elsewhere. A peek through Patel's old interviews reveals pretty quickly a long list of people he might go after who, according to him, allegedly committed felonies. Listen.
The Clappers and the Brennans and the Comeys of the world will always lie. And when we're back in power, we will prosecute them for lying to Congress, which is a felony. Members of Congress can't hide behind the speech and debate clause for committing felonies when it comes to destroying and suppressing evidence to law enforcement agencies.
I think there was other lies told by Cassidy Hutchinson under oath. She's also subject to federal prosecution for lying under oath to federal officials. That's a felony.
So Trump will have, if that man, Kash Patel, is confirmed by the United States Senate, an FBI director ready to go and jump, perhaps, at the chance to prosecute Trump's perceived political enemies with crimes, in his word, felonies. And as we saw this week, with House Republicans releasing a report saying that former Congresswoman Liz Cheney, who is likely at the top of Trump's enemy within list, should be prosecuted, we know he's got allies in Congress willing to do his bidding without any facts, without any reason. A lie wrapped up in predication, maybe. On the flip side, new reporting from NBC News finds something that didn't exist last time, a support network of sorts mobilizing around the public targets of Trump and Patel's ire. Quote, lawyers and pro-democracy advocates are in the early stages of building a nationwide network of specialists aimed at defending and protecting people who may be targeted for retribution once President-elect Donald Trump takes office. That's according to multiple people involved in the effort. Those working to create the infrastructure said that in addition to lawyers, they are recruiting accountants to help people who may find their taxes under audit, employment experts to advise those who could be fired or reassigned without cause, public relations professionals to assist anyone whose reputations might be tarnished by accusations, and even psychologists to help potential targets manage the stress that comes with being in the federal government's crosshairs. That effort is where we start the hour with some of our favorite experts and friends. Former lead investigator for the January 6th Select Committee, Tim Heaphy's here. Also joining us, former acting assistant attorney general for national security at the Department of Justice, MSNBC legal analyst Mary McCord's here, and president of Media Matters for America, Angelo Carusone is back. Angelo, I love starting with you for many reasons, but chief among them is your granular understanding of what exactly is in black and white in writing in terms of their plans for retribution using the FBI. Will you take us through, again, not being paranoid, not projecting onto them things Trump said at rallies, but what is in the plan?
I mean, they wrote it down, and then they didn't just write it down, they then talked about it. And so part of what the strategy is a bit of a shock and awe. You go in right away, and you fire as many people as you possibly can. And though, even if you can't, you install as many loyalists, those that don't need to be given assignments of retribution because they already understand the assignment. They're going in with the assignment. And that's what Project 2025 was designed to do, was to actually give both the step-by-step guide for what has to happen out of the gate, and to then vet and organize the personnel that can help execute that. Because it's worth keeping in mind that when we talk about Kash Patel as potentially the FBI director, he's not going to be doing all the work himself. That's going to need to be assigned out to actual agents and people at the FBI. And that's where this larger infrastructure comes in place. MAGA had been professionalized over the past few years via Project 2025, and that's how it turns that's how you turn these agencies into an actual instrument of revenge. And so when you take that and you overlay that with the things that Patel has already been saying publicly, the idea is you go out there, you find a couple of these individuals that will send a very clear message, and you just investigate, and you find one or two things that you can really hang your hat onto to unravel these larger narratives. And so I don't think it's a coincidence that they're going after January 6th, because one of the first things they need to show is that all of the attacks against Trump over the past few years were all illegitimate, because this entire January 6th thing was nothing more than a hoax perpetuated by the media and Democrats in order to serve as one of the bulwarks for the deep state against Donald Trump. And that's part of it. It's to send a message, and it's now built on top of a much more professional operation.
The other thing I was thinking about, Angela, where they may seek to be more, I don't even know the word, but more maniacal in their selections to lead the U.S. Attorney's Office, is they met some resistance in people like Jeff Berman, who was the U.S. Attorney overseeing SDNY, who sent crummy cases back. He was asked to, I think, investigate or bring a case against either Kerry or Greg Craig. He writes about it in his book, and he sends it back to Maine DOJ, and they simply farmed it out to a more amenable office. It feels like they maybe have learned how to avoid those pockets of resistance.
That's exactly right. I mean, one of the things that Patel has indicated very clearly is that most of the things that are done should no longer be, both the investigation side as well as the prosecution side, you should avoid Washington, D.C. as much as possible. In fact, you should move as much of the investigations out to offices across the country. And whenever you can, you should stretch the degree of jurisdiction, and you should make prosecutions all across the country as well in friendlier jurisdictions where the jury pool there is going to be more sympathetic to the story that you're telling, or maybe the targets that you're going after. So it's not just that they, in terms of the initiation of these investigations and potential prosecutions, they've also thought about how to help them be successful on the back end as well, by finding more friendlier forums and more friendly jury pools. And the part that I find most disturbing in all of this is Patel's particular understanding of not just all these execution parts, but then his relationship to the larger right-wing media fever swamps. One of the things he bragged about when he was on the board at Truth Social was how they would take narratives from QAnon, from the QAnon and weave them into their overall messaging, because it helped build support and kinetic energy and momentum for the stories that they were telling. And so when you have somebody that understands how to tap into this right-wing media machine and those fever swamps, and how to take these little breadcrumbs that you would get as a result of these investigations, you can start to see how it all comes together. You break Maine justice, so that's no longer one of the barriers or firewalls against injustice. You farm it out to as many friendly places as you can that are going to pursue these investigations, maybe way outside the bounds and the norms. Then you initiate prosecutions in forums where over the last year you've been using these breadcrumbs to tell, and the right-wing media, to tell these stories that validate the already false narratives and conspiracies that many of these right-wing audiences believe, and now you're going to hand them a target served up on a platter in a prosecution that never would have taken place there in the first place. But now we're in a new reality where they're really operationalizing all these components together. And Kash Patel isn't just a key part of that; he's somebody that keenly understands it.
I mean, Mary, breadcrumbs is a good word to use for it. Senator Chris Murphy had an admonition for the press in their straight coverage, which is fair. of what Congressman Loudermilk sought to do with a non-fact-based accusation against Liz Cheney that Frank Figliuzzi worried could become predicate for opening an investigation into her conduct on the January 6th Select Committee. Your thoughts about what should happen and what could happen?
Well, I think this does seem like it was basically fabricated in order to make a referral come from Congress for a criminal investigation so that the incoming president can do the kind of thing he tends to do, which is a bit of a dodge and a weave. I'm not going to direct investigations. Oh, but these people may deserve to be to be investigated. This will be up to Kash Patel. Oh, Congress seems to think that they need to be investigated. And so I think it does provide some cover to him and some sort of, at least from his perspective, plausible deniability that he's not the one directing any type of retribution. This is coming from Congress, from the House after an extensive 2-year investigation. There's another thing I worry about besides the fact that potentially Kash Patel will find enough complicit people within the FBI to actually launch largely baseless investigations. But I also worry about the distraction of resources, of FBI resources and potentially Department of Justice resources from things that actually should be getting investigated. We are certainly not at any low point when it comes to other types of national security threats, both terrorism threats as well as espionage threats, threats from our adversaries. We certainly have other just more traditional domestic criminal cases that the FBI normally spends time on. Those include, fraud investigations, transnational drug trafficking. They include hate crimes, right? So there are a lot of other things, a lot of other areas that the FBI's vast resources should be deployed to. And in addition to being concerned about baseless investigations, I'm also concerned about just really dropping the ball when it comes to legitimate national security concerns and also public safety concerns.
I mean, I share your worry, Mary, but there hasn't been a book written about the first Trump presidency that didn't detail Trump constantly hectoring the likes of Bill Barr and Christopher Wray over inane things, fabricated political prosecutions and investigations that had nothing to do with the ongoing threats from China and Iran and Russia and otherwise. I mean, have you seen any evidence that even if someone wanted to focus on the threats to U.S. national security, they would be undeterred by someone like Trump, seemingly obsessed? I mean, I could have played for 2 hours all of his musing and fetishizing political revenge.
I mean, I do think career men and women within the FBI, within the intelligence community, within the Department of Defense and the Department of Justice and our other national security agencies will be trying to keep up with the threats wherever they may come from abroad, and will be trying to take actions that they're authorized to take to try to mitigate those threats. We'll be trying to get the attention of the political appointees. And, I totally take your point and agree with you that certainly the former President Trump, his first time in office, did not seem often to want to take these things seriously. But there are people in government who will, and that could even include some appointees, including appointees who haven't been named yet. We focus so much on, the secretary level appointees and problems with nominees like Pete Hegseth, for example, certainly with someone like Kash Patel. And John Ratcliffe and others. And we have concerns about those, but there are many more who we don't know. And there is something about being in that environment and seeing the threats coming in every day. And I'm going to put Donald Trump aside because he certainly has those threats with his presidential daily briefing presented to him every day. I don't know how much he listened to those presentations, but there are others who are in that milieu all day long, every day, who will appreciate, I do believe, will appreciate the seriousness and try to take them seriously and try to make sure adequate resources are put toward them. I mean, that's what I have to hope for.
That's our best hope, that they'll be scared enough by the actual intelligence that they'll see it, that it won't be influenced by anyone else atop those agencies. and respond in a manner consistent with the history of people in these agencies. Tim Havey, let's talk about Congressman Loudermilk and what he's done. This also may have a degree of something personal involved. Wasn't he also investigated, or his office investigated, for conduct that included folks and visitors to his office taking some strange photos and touring? Do I have that right?
Yes, Nicole, exactly right. Perhaps I always hesitate to ascribe undue motivation to any public servant absent evidence, but it is certainly true that for a period of time, the Select Committee focused on a tour that Representative Loudermilk gave to some constituents who ended up at the Capitol the next day. If you recall, there was some allegation early on that there had been members of Congress that gave tours to rioters that somehow were involved in a collusion or conspiracy to help people prepare for an insurrection. Candidly, we did not find evidence of that, of explicit agreement between members of Congress and rioters, surveillance or tours that gave rise to that kind of activity. We looked at it and we did not reach those conclusions, and we said so. Representative Loudermilk's tour was of a constituent who, yes, came to Washington to participate in the Ellipse rally and ended up at the Capitol, was not a charged rioter, this person to whom he gave a tour. And he did take some photographs, this constituent, in the Capitol complex, in the office buildings. But we never concluded that Representative Loudermilk did anything affirmatively to aid an insurrection. That said, the focus on him, yes, was unusual and was different from other members of Congress. He then is the person who's the chairman of the subcommittee on administration that is investigating the investigators. And I have to say, reading his report, there is just absolutely no basis for the very serious allegations he makes against Ms. Cheney, against Chairman Thompson in the committee. You know, this notion of destroying records is a complete fabrication. Every official record of the Select Committee was maintained. The videos of witness interviews are not the official record. The official record of those interviews is the transcript. Those were all maintained. A handful of those involved national security officials, Secret Service agents, aides in very sensitive positions in the White House, and the Biden White House, as a condition of our access to them, said that we could not make those interviews public. We had to return them. And I believe that Congressman Loudermilk ultimately got those transcripts himself. So there's just been no hiding of information. And the accusation against Ms. Cheney about somehow witness tampering, you know, she was involved because of her credibility with encouraging a lot of witnesses, Republican witnesses, to come forward. There's no way we would have had as much success in accessing people like Cassidy Hutchinson or Bill Barr or Mark Milley if it had not been for Ms. Cheney's credibility as a longtime Republican. And she simply received the information from Ms. Hutchinson that was inconsistent from what she provided earlier. Ms. Hutchinson explained the reason for that. She didn't come forward because she was afraid to, and it wasn't until she had independent counsel that she did. That Ms. Cheney didn't make that up. She's simply reporting what we heard from a very important witness. So I just think this allegation in the report that she should be referred for criminal prosecution, I just see no foundation whatsoever for that allegation.
What is your sense of the bigger picture of why Liz, and specifically her communications with Cassidy Hutchinson, are being manufactured as a potential predicate for investigation?
Yeah, look, I think Ms. Cheney is a lightning rod. She's been a very outspoken critic of the president. She was very, very visible as the vice chair of our committee. And as a result, she attracts a lot of attention. There's no question that she was vitally involved in our investigation. She's a good lawyer, and she asked good questions, and she was personally very involved in the day-to-day work of the committee. That is what we should expect from our public servants. She did the right thing by doing her best to try to get the facts and circumstances that informed the attack on the Capitol. But because of her high profile, because of how persuasive I think she has been, she is a lightning rod.
Tim Havey, Mary McCord, Angelo Carusone, thank you so much for having this conversation with us. When we come back, more evidence of a strong economy, but with Donald Trump threatening tariffs and mass deportations, the big question on Wall Street now is how long will it last? We'll have that conversation next.
I think it's pretty clear we've avoided a recession. I think growth this year has been solid. The U.S. economy has just been remarkable, and it's when in these international meetings that I attend, this has been the story: is that how well the U.S. is doing. If you look around the world, there's just a lot of slow growth and continuous struggle with inflation. So I feel very good about where the economy is and the performance of the economy.
That was Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell with a good report on the U.S. economy yesterday on how inflation has eased significantly over the past 2 years. That is why Powell was able to announce another quarter-point cut to the national interest rate, the third consecutive cut of the year 2024. But the Fed also did something else. It signaled that it will make fewer of these interest rate cuts in the next year, and that inflation will still linger in 2025, and that sent stocks tumbling. It also probably pushed Powell closer to the top of Donald Trump's 2025 enemies list. But for the Fed and the economy, the reality is that what happens next under the Trump administration is frankly anyone's guess. And all the uncertainty cited by Powell yesterday should, in a normal world, be a reality check for Trump about how any of this economy he cares so much about, how it actually works, and why the Fed chair and not the president has this specific authority, as well as about the damage his proposed mass deportations and steep tariffs could do to the economy. Joining our conversation, CNBC senior Washington correspondent Eamon Javers, and with me at the table, NBC News senior business correspondent Christine Romans. I felt this way when I first saw Powell field a question about whether he would leave because Trump wanted him to, and he said no, and they said why, and he said it's against the law. And I thought, oh, wow. This could be the friction point. I feel like in Trump 1.0, it was between Trump and the FBI, Trump and DOJ, and Trump 2.0. This could be one of those friction points. Does the Fed see it that way?
And that recent crisp no that Chair Powell said, no, I'm not going to leave if you ask me to leave. Do you think legally he could make you leave? No. Just a no, and moving on. The Fed chief has been very clear that they are the inflation fighter, and that is the most important thing here, and that they are independent. The Fed is independent. Presidents would like lower interest rates because it gooses the economy and can make them look better, right? His job is to have inflation under control and maximum employment, and he has said again and again that that is the Fed's goal. Now, the tough part now is that he's acknowledging that inflation still hasn't vanquished. The economy is still good, really good, and so they can sit back. They don't have to cut interest rates, and that could be something that the president-elect does not like in the beginning of next year.
Eamon, what is your sense of how much they anticipate interest rates being a political cudgel that Trump tries to wield on a day-to-day basis?
Well, look, Donald Trump is definitely a low interest rate guy. He has said that. And the state of play here right now is that Trump has said, he believes he has the authority to fire Jay Powell if he wants to, but he doesn't want to just yet. That's sort of what he's asserting out there. It's not at all clear that he does have that authority. That's never been tested in the courts, so it's kind of a legal gray area of whether a president can push out a Fed chair who doesn't want to go if it's not for cause. And the question is, what would Jay Powell do if Trump said, it's time for you to go? He struck a very defiant tone, as you point out, and said, no, that's not illegal under the law. And Jay Powell, as we know, is somebody who adamantly supports the independence of the Fed and is willing to really fight for that and dig in his heels. But Trump has a lot of options here. He could do something like announce in advance who his next Fed chair nominee will be. And that sort of hobbles Jay Powell's ability to communicate to global markets, because a lot of interest from financial professionals will go to who that other person is who's now speaking for Trump, and Powell will have less ability to speak to markets going forward. So there are ways for Trump to undermine Powell short of firing him. But I think you're right. This is one of the potential friction points going into 25. Let
me show you what Powell said yesterday about an economic analysis of Trump's stated policies, which we should stipulate. It's possible his stated policies don't become the actual policies, but here's what he said about what we know.
We just don't know really very much at all about the actual policies, so it's very premature to try to make any kind of conclusion. We don't know what will be tariffed from what countries, for how long, in what size. We don't know whether there'll be, retaliatory tariffs. I just think we need to take our time, not rush and make a very careful assessment, but only when we've actually seen what the policies are and how they're implemented.
I mean, it's a $64 million question in the time of Trump. Right. We don't know much about the actual policies. You know, historically, neither does anyone at the White House, because some of them are made up as Trump takes in information. In the past, it was from Fox News. Who knows if it'll be from other podcasts and other places this time around. But traditionally, there has not been a policy process. How do the markets respond to that?
Well, and it's so interesting because Jay Powell was asked again and again about tariffs and deportations and tax cuts and deregulation and how these things would affect the economy. And he so steadfastly doesn't want to talk about those things until they would happen and they would take it, you know, case by case. So it's sort of like a reporter's pulling him into this conversation. He doesn't want to talk about the hypothetical for Donald Trump. But when you just look at what Trump himself has said, you know, tax cuts mean we could be, and deficits mean the U.S. is going to be issuing more bonds. You know, there are all these things that could be happening that could really be inflationary and could be really disruptive to the American economy next year at a point right now where the economy is pretty solid overall. But we just don't know what is exactly going to happen.
I mean, we do know that there is no sort of vanity on Trump's part like a strong economy, and I guess people hope that he won't want to wreck it. Is that the sort of private talk?
Yes, he uses the stock market as his own personal scorecard.
Correct.
For only taking the credit, never the blame.
Right.
And presidents get too much credit and too much blame, by the way, for the stock market and for everything in the economy. But there is this kind of feeling that it is going to be some sort of a countermeasure to what his instincts are next year if, in fact, the market moves. Donald Trump has said it won't. Donald Trump has said that everybody is wrong, that tariffs are inflationary and that they're a tax. He just has a completely different worldview than the experts.
In the words of our next guest, quote, "It's happening right in front of our eyes." The first shots being fired against the pillars of our democracy and the rule of law by Donald Trump. Events in the last few days showing just how quickly the Democratic experiment will be tested. And it's all happening even before Donald Trump is sworn in. There's the case study in obeying in advance, as Professor Timothy Snyder puts it, happening not in Hungary or Turkey or Russia this time, but right here. Scores of business leaders seemingly determined to curry favor with Donald Trump, as we witnessed Donald Trump using civil litigation to pursue any media outlet or anyone who displeases him, even a pollster who came out with a shock poll ahead of the November election. And as we witnessed media outlets absorb those blows, the headlines speak for themselves. CNN writing this, quote, "Emboldened by ABC's settlement, Trump threatens more lawsuits against the press." PBS wrote it this way, quote, "ABC News settlement with Trump raises concerns about press freedom in his second term." And again, all of it's happening in public, out in the open, in front of our eyes, the seeds being planted for the retribution against the most outspoken and prominent critics of Donald Trump that he promised. On Tuesday, House Republicans released a report calling for January 6th committee Vice Chairwoman Liz Cheney to be investigated by the FBI. That report claims that she, quote, "colluded with star witness Cassidy Hutchinson without Hutchinson's attorney's knowledge in order to change her testimony." The Republicans claim it was witness tampering. And if that report is the kerosene, Donald Trump is the match. He posted late last night that Cheney could, quote, "be in a lot of trouble," end quote. This is, of course, after he promised during his campaign for her to be tried in a military tribunal. Cassidy Hutchinson's attorney telling NBC News that the claim that Hutchinson colluded with Cheney is, quote, "preposterous." Adding this, quote, "Ms. Hutchinson made the independent decision to part ways with her Trump-funded lawyer, freeing her to provide candid, truthful, and honorable testimony to the January 6th committee about the attack on the Capitol, alongside dozens of Republican witnesses and law enforcement officers." Cheney released a blistering statement of her own on this report and its accusations. We'll read it to you in full. It says this, quote, "January 6 showed Donald Trump for who he really is, a cruel and vindictive man who allowed violent attacks to continue against our Capitol and law enforcement officers, while he watched on television and refused for hours to instruct his supporters to stand down and leave." The January 6 committee's hearings and report featured scores of Republican witnesses, including many of the most senior officials from Trump's own White House, his campaign, and administration. All of this testimony was painstakingly set out in thousands of pages of transcripts, made public along with a highly detailed and meticulously sourced 800-page report. The Department of Justice conducted its own independent investigation and reached the same fundamental conclusions. Now, Chairman Loudermilk's interim report intentionally disregards the truth of the Select Committee's tremendous weight of evidence and instead fabricates lies and defamatory allegations in an attempt to cover up what Donald Trump did. Their allegations do not reflect a review of the actual evidence and are malicious and a cowardly assault on the truth. No reputable lawyer, legislator, or judge would take this seriously, end quote. But the facts have never stopped Donald Trump and his allies from trying. Here's Lara Trump reacting to the Loudermilk report.
What they have perpetrated on the American people by way of this January 6th hoax is absolutely terrible, and it is a stain on our country's history. These people ought to be ashamed of themselves. I know they aren't, so we'll go ahead and shame them. We'll go ahead and make sure they never forget that history recalls every single day from now till forever what these people did and the way they personally and single-handedly tried to destroy this country. Thank goodness God is good, and he always shows us. He shines the light in the dark places. This is just the beginning, Benny. If you think this is good, wait till Donald Trump gets in there. Wait till Kash Patel gets in there. Wait till Tulsi Gabbard gets in there.
This is just the beginning, Benny. Democratic Senator from Connecticut, Chris Murphy. Senator, thank you for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
You inspired a lot of our approach to these headlines today. You knitted them together before we did. So I'll let you expand on your thoughts as shared on social media.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Listen, I just think the last 4 days have been really important because you are seeing how this plan is going to work, and it's just going to be on hyperdrive once he becomes president. So there are a lot of countries in the world that technically have elections, but they're not real democracies. And the reason they're not real democracies is because the opposition becomes so weak out of fear of criminal prosecution, and the press becomes so cowed by the regime that there's actually not a real choice in any of these elections. And Trump has been telling you over the last 4 days exactly how he's going to do that. This effort to line up a criminal prosecution of Liz Cheney is a clear signal that if you cross him, you could end up in jail. And no one's going to stop him because this time around, he has a Department of Justice that doesn't care about the law. He's got a director of the FBI who actually believes that Trump's political opponents should be in jail. And he's got enough judges that are MAGA loyalists that they might actually work the rules to put Liz Cheney or others in jail. You put side by side with that this lawsuit against the Des Moines Register, totally baseless, but really just designed to intimidate the press into folding and refraining from criticizing Donald Trump, or in this case, not even commissioning a poll that might have some bad news for Trump and might give some oxygen to his political opposition. In countries where that happens, where the opposition fears going to jail, so they stay home, and the press doesn't tell the truth because they fear consequences, democracy dies. It just does. You still have elections, but the opposition is so weak that they can never win. And Trump, over the last 4 days, is showing you that plan to suppress the opposition and to suppress the press. And so far, he has had stunning success even before he gets sworn in.
What is the remedy at this point if he's put so many cards on the table and received the desired response, advance of actually wielding any constitutional power?
Yeah, I think the most important remedy right now is for this not to be normalized. I read all the headlines about the Liz Cheney criminal referral yesterday, and almost every single one of them in mainstream media played this straight as if this was as if this was a normal, regular function of legislative power, instead of telling the truth, which is that this is made up out of thin air. There's not even a shred of a crime committed here. But if you read the headlines yesterday, you thought that Liz Cheney actually did something criminally wrong. And so as leaders, we can't accept that this is normal. As journalists, you can't accept that this is normal. The minute that we pretend that this is a normal exercise of executive power is the day that people give up fighting. So we've got these nomination fights coming up on Pam Bondi and Kash Patel. We should fight as Democrats like democracy is on the ballot, because it is. And if we don't show outrage right now, then the public is going to just accept that this is a normal circumstance of present day democracy. So showing some fight right now, both in the private sector and amongst electeds, is really important.
A key hire in the Trump administration, sending a very clear signal in opposition to reproductive freedom and the rights of women to have access to abortion health care. We'll tell you about it. Deadline White House continues after a quick break. Don't go anywhere.
Do you believe in punishment for abortion? Yes or no, as a principle?
The answer is that there has to be some form of punishment.
For the woman?
Yeah, there has to be some form.
Well, he has always said exactly what he wants to do to the women, punish them. That was Donald Trump's now infamous response during a campaign town hall in 2016, that he believes, and doubles down there with Chris Matthews, in punishing women who have abortions. Now it looks like he's putting the people into place who will do that for him. Trump has announced he would appoint Ed Martin, the author of the RNC platform that Life Begins at Conception, to be Chief of Staff of the Office of Management and Budget, the agency entrusted with implementing Donald Trump's Project 2025 agenda. His views are so extreme, you should hear them for yourself.
I certainly think that you're going to find a lot of people that step away from jail time because they're going to say, well, this is, but if you believe it's a baby, I do, then you have to do something to protect the baby. The late Phyllis Schlafly, whom I worked so closely with, used to say, if you get to claim and frame the argument, you almost certainly get to win. In other words, if you take their framing, it's a woman's right. Are you going to put women in jail? No, it's about a baby. Now what do we do? Frame the argument, own the argument.
One of the most common exceptions called for is an exception to abortion laws in cases where the mother's life is at risk. I'm entirely opposed to this language. It's an absolute scientific fact that no abortion is ever performed to save the life of the mother. None. Zero. Zilch.
Wow. Let that sink in. No exceptions for the life of the mother. If you somehow manage to get one to save your life, Ed Martin had his way, they might put you in prison. It shouldn't be surprising that anti-abortion state leaders see an opening to intensify the persecution of women and doctors. On Friday, Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton announced he would be suing a New York doctor for providing abortion pills to a woman living in Texas. Let's bring into our coverage President of Reproductive Freedom for All, Minnie Timaraju. Minnie, your thoughts?
I mean, this is Project 2025 come to life, Nicole. This is everything we warned about and screamed about that just under half of the country recognized, right? These guys are the extremist architects of some of the most cruel policies in this country. You know, Ed Martin didn't just say the quiet part out loud. He's a right-wing talk radio host. He gleefully proclaimed it out loud. So if anyone thought for 5 seconds that Donald Trump was going to moderate his tune, they were sorely mistaken. The thing that our exit polling and our work that we're seeing in the field post the election that's important for us to remember, though, is that not all Americans understood or still understand that the Trump administration and all these appointees are so radical on abortion. He said he wants to leave it to the states. So what we have to do is educate the American people about Ed Martin and other appointees that are deeply problematic, but also explain to them why the Office of Management and Budget has anything to do with abortion and why this is so dangerous, because it's not obvious on its face.
So let's hear more of Ed. This is about a rape victim who was 10 years old.
The true bane of the pro-life movement is the faction of fake pro-lifers who claim to believe in the sanctity of human life, but are only willing to vote that way with a list of exceptions.
This horrendous story in Ohio where a 10-year-old child was raped. This 10-year-old was brought up as an example of why abortion is necessary. Now, I have said over and over again that, the examples that shouldn't be the rule, right? You can't let the exceptions be the rule, especially when you get engaged in a debate. And I refuse to do it. I refuse.
I mean, Ed's refusal to get engaged in the debate doesn't save the 10-year-old rape victim. What happens to them in Donald Trump's America?
I mean, nothing. They get to live out their misery, the consequences that those right-wing extremists believe a 10-year-old rape victim should face. Look, the critical difference between a Trump administration, as we're seeing it play out, and the Biden-Harris administration, which we are seeing come to an end, is that the Biden-Harris administration was willing to use every tool in their toolbox, every arm of the federal government, from DOJ to HHS to OMB, et cetera, to advance reproductive freedom and to intervene when states were overreaching, like such cases as emergency medical care in Idaho, the case that went to the Supreme Court, or when their own authority, like the FDA, were challenged on medication abortion. We are now going to see not just an absence of activity from the federal government, but extreme activists embedded in the government who are going to try to push an agenda using every tool they can find, including invoking things like Comstock.
This has been Primetime Weekend. I'm Nicole Wallace. Please tune into Deadline White House and all of our primetime shows weekdays on MSNBC.